Welcome to the 1 Million Years of Joy podcast. I'm Dr. Andrea Benaker, your host, and my intention is to inspire you to find more joy in your life through the stories from our guests and the science on joy and purpose. I'm delighted you could join us today, and I'm super happy to introduce you to Michaela Alexis, who helps businesses and individuals shine on LinkedIn. She is a trainer on LinkedIn and a speaker that talks about the power of personal branding. She has chronicled her journey about switching careers, stage fright, IVF, pregnancy, returning from maternity leave, PTSD, and finding balance as a working mom. She has built an impressive audience that is inspired by her work every single day. Michaela, welcome. I'm delighted that you could join us today.
Well, I am delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Michaela, tell us about what your life has been, particularly since you recently become a mother. And I'm curious as to how much joy this has brought into your life, particularly given that you've experienced many challenges. Can you please share with us the journey of becoming a mother and the joy it has actually brought you?
Yeah, I would be happy to. I mean, life is chaotic and beautiful and crazy and all of the things, but yeah, it did take a long time for me to kind of get to this point. And I think it's hard to be in a season of waiting, period. So for anybody that's out there, even if you can't relate to my story of infertility, certainly you can probably relate to that feeling of kind of waiting for your life to begin. And that's what it really felt like the last 4 years of my life. Got a diagnosis that I only had a 5% chance of having children. From there, kind of was brought right into fertility treatments, all the while still trying to grow my business, run my business. And those two together just seemed to be so different. You know, I would get on stage and I'm smiling and I'm interacting with people, and then I would just go back to my hotel room and just be so sad. I mean, part of it was the hormonal treatments, part of it was the fact that nothing seemed to be working, and just kind of like wondering, like, you know, I'm getting everything that I hoped for in my career. I'm like doing what I really love to do, and it's not bringing me joy because there's this big piece of me that's still missing. And so went through an IUI, went through surgery for endometriosis, jumped right into IVF, and we were super, super blessed that the first transfer ended up being my crazy 16-month-old girl now. But even, you know, postpartum and kind of among this, like, you know, happy ever after, I've still had like health issues. In October, I had 2 emergency surgeries for my gallbladder, so I'm dealing with PTSD from that. But I have learned as I have gone through the craziest, especially the last 3 years of my life, the craziest health challenges, that joy isn't necessarily this thing that like constantly exists. It really takes effort and energy to find those slivers of joy among all of those things that happen, because life is hard. It's not always easy and fun and delightful, but there are so many moments of beauty even in the pain that I have, learned to kind of embrace the good days and the bad days.
So beautiful. And thank you so much for sharing that in such an authentic way. I'd love for you to share with us how did you come about to experience PTSD? Can you just share a little bit more about that and how
Yeah.
you're able to find joy? Because
Yeah.
it's tremendously challenging at the
Yeah.
mental level, emotional level, even physical
Yeah.
level. How did you get through it?
Yeah, I'm still kind of not in the midst of PTSD. I'm being treated for it right now. PTSD is really a challenging thing to go through because most people don't recognize PTSD beyond for veterans and military personnel. But PTSD can exist in all sorts of ways. There can be childhood PTSD, things that happened to you in your childhood that have created trauma response. You see a lot of people that come forward with, you know, child abuse allegations and things like that. that way after the fact. And people are like, how does that happen? And it's because our brain kind of shuts down that memory that is too painful for us to process. So PTSD can happen in all sorts of ways from childhood on. For me in particular, it was in October when I had my gallbladder out. I had horrible, horrible pain, and that in itself, having those gallbladder attacks consecutively and ending up in the ER was traumatic enough. I went and had emergency surgery. It was at the point where I was full of stones and it had to be taken out. But I woke up and couldn't open my eyes, was struggling to breathe, was looking around. Everything was really hazy. And I genuinely, well, I was essentially dying. I was bleeding internally. They recognized that I was bleeding internally, told me that they had to bring me back into the operating room. It was just so scary in that moment because I just felt so alone. I didn't have my family around. I didn't really know what was going on. I didn't know what the things that people were saying meant. I started wondering, am I going to see my daughter again? All of those things. And so that moment for me was definitely the trigger for my PTSD over the last few months since. Thankfully, they were able to bring me back into the operating room. They had punctured an artery the first time that they brought me into surgery. I guess I have arteries apparently in strange places. So they were able to, with one stitch me up. The recovery was just awful. But the thing that really scared me is that, and I've dealt with a lot of anxiety, different flavors of anxiety, social anxiety, agoraphobia. But when I came home, I was just so unable to connect with anybody. Like I didn't feel any sort of bond with anybody. They put my daughter on my lap and I just kind of looking at her smiling, but I just felt nothing. I felt numb. My mom's smiling at me and talking to me, and I'm looking at her. I'm like, I feel numb. Like I don't feel any emotion towards you. And that was really scary because I hadn't felt that before. And I didn't know what that was. I didn't know if it was just, this is something that's going to happen in the days after a really traumatic event and it will go away. But over time, I started getting more symptoms. I was afraid to leave my house. I had to have lights on a certain way. So I became very OCD about things in my house. That's another thing that I've never experienced before. And then I had what's called derealization. And so these would be episodes where I could be sitting where I am right now and looking outside, and all of a sudden I am trying to figure out if I'm in a dream or not. It just everything felt very hazy. I felt kind of out of my own body. It was really hard to kind of snap back into it. And it's not a good feeling. It's a really awful feeling. It's not like a good dream. It felt like a nightmare where it was like, oh my God, I'm not grounded. That's the best way to explain it, as I felt like I wasn't grounded at all. And those episodes tended to happen either when I was alone, because again, I had health anxiety. So I was worried that if, I got sick, there would be nobody to help me. Or if I was going to my mom's house to drop off Isla, because the last time I went to my mom's house was the first time I had a major gallbladder attack and ended up in the ER. So the body keeps score for sure. And even if you don't have these like very vivid flashbacks or that are generally associated with PTSD, you can have a lot of these other symptoms like disconnection from people around you, derealization, where you feel like you're not quite in real life, depersonalization, where you actually feel like you are not yourself anymore. You're kind of floating above people. There are so many PTSD symptoms that people don't know and don't recognize. I mean, I believe, especially when it comes to birth in general is very traumatic. And there's so many women that have, on top of PTSD postpartum anxiety and depression, maybe dealing with PTSD and not know it, because there's just so little information about what that might look like for somebody that isn't coming back from a war. So that, I think for me, the hardest part of everything has just been never dealing with these symptoms and not knowing what they were, and kind of recognizing that once I did realize I was PTSD, that I need to get help immediately.
And since you've gotten the help and you've been treated,
Yeah.
is life back to normal? Is it
Yeah.
back, are you able to feel
Yeah.
more joy and enjoy
Yeah,
the moment with your
absolutely.
daughter?
Yeah, we're definitely getting there. I think that the most important thing for me has been finding a therapist that was trained in trauma therapy to just help heal those parts. And that's been an interesting experience for me because I have always been a huge fan of therapy in general. I think everybody should have a therapist that they love and they can talk to. But trauma therapy is very different because it actually forces you to go back to those places, those triggering moments, and kind of break down those feelings. So you do end up leaving sessions like crying, but it's just unlocked, it's kind of released me from those moments. It Every time I do it, I feel a little bit unshackled, because what the body tries to do essentially is that it kind of banks that memory and then it creates these physical symptoms. So if you can unlock those moments of trauma and work with a professional, this is not something you can necessarily do with yourself. You need to do with somebody that's trained, but unlock those moments and kind of go through those feelings and unpack them, it really like makes life so much lighter. So yeah, absolutely. Since last fall, I have gotten amazing help. I've gotten so much support, but it does take you recognizing that there is an issue and that you don't feel like yourself and putting up your hand and saying, I need help. And I have put up both hands and said, like, whatever support I can get from my family doctor, from perinatal mental health groups, from my therapist that's trained in trauma therapy, whatever I had access to, I knew that I needed to take advantage of because I don't want to live that way. I wanted to live a joyful life and I want to go back to enjoying this precious miracle that I waited so long for. So we're on a good path.
So happy to hear, and thank you again for sharing that journey and the advice you're giving to other people that may not even want to recognize indeed that some of the past histories that we are just pressing down and ignoring to some extent could really take away our joy from living today in a more positive spirit. It's so
Yeah.
essential.
Yeah, I think that sometimes we feel like trauma is reserved for very, very serious things. Like we almost like grade our trauma and we need to stop doing that. If there's something that is, like you're saying, kind of preventing you from living a joyful life, that's valid and that's something that you like deserve to be able to work through and get past. But I know that that's a huge roadblock for so many people where they think that it's like, oh yeah, this was traumatic for me, but it wasn't traumatic enough, or they don't even admit that it was a traumatic experience because it's like, just like I was talking about with birth, it's like, oh well, everybody gives birth, so maybe if it feels traumatic, it's traumatic. Like you don't have to validate your trauma to anybody. And I think a big part of living joyfully is knowing yourself and believing yourself and finding all the resources that you can to like live life the happiest that you possibly can.
Yes, and it's essential in the end. I'm curious to know how your perspective on joy has shifted through all these experiences and what actually even brought you joy before even wanting to become a mother and becoming a
Mm.
mother. How were you before and what were the sources of joy in your life when you were much younger?
Oh, when I was much younger, I think creativity in general. I feel like since I was young, I have always, I had the imaginary friend and then would play house and read books. And I think play combined with creativity has always been the thing that has brought me the most joy. And I noticed even when I was on maternity leave, I was like almost like itching. Like, sometimes like you have this thing that brings you joy and it's like, I need to go back to doing that thing. And I felt that so much. And by the time like I finally went on LinkedIn and was able to write again, I remember like sitting back and being like, like I feel so much better. So yeah, I think like from the beginning, it's always been writing and just stories in general. I love hearing stories. So like podcasts, reading books. I've written a book. I love to write. And so that process of both absorbing and sharing stories really like just lights up my soul. That's something that's still true today. And I think that like motherhood isn't a replacement for joy. It's something that is like Isla is the sweetest, cutest little girl, and she makes me smile every day. But I also know that I am not just a mom and I need to not, and I see so many parents that kind of make this mistake of like, my child brings me happiness happiness, or my child is my purpose. And, you know, Isla is my purpose. She brings purpose to my life. Absolutely. But I need to have more. I need to have something for myself that brings me joy. And I need to learn how to spark joy in myself. It's not the responsibility of a 1-year old to make me happy all the time. It's up to me to figure out, okay, you know, I have everything that I want, but I still feel like something's missing. And I think that like that happens all the time in our life. I don't know if there's like this point where it's like, you know, Isla is certainly a happily ever after, but there's still parts of my story that come after that. You know what I mean? So it's like I'm still going out there. I'm still working with LinkedIn, and I would love to go and re-record my courses. I want to get on camera and I want to get on stages still, because that's what lights me up. And I know just from growing up, my dad was a doctor and my mom was a teacher. And both of those are professions that kind of require you to give your entire self to. And so I was really, really lucky in that I saw both parents work that they really, really loved. And so that's given me the permission to do the same. And also, on the flip side of that, my mom was originally a nun and then became a teacher. And my dad was a used car salesman and a handyman, and he operated an elevator. This is way back in the day. My dad was much older than my mom. He passed away when he was 87. He was actually the person that operated the elevators in New York for a summer, and then he eventually became a doctor. And so watching them both kind of try different things and have a very unconventional path has also given me the permission to do the same. And so I love that, and I hope that, you know, I can show that same spirit of experimentation and trying new things and failing at some things. Like, those are lessons that I want to give to Isla, because it also gives her the permission to do the same thing, to try different things in her life and figure out what brings her joy. Because sometimes I just feel like people are kind of given this path and it's like, this is what you need to do. I think that life is more like a zigzag. It's not a straight path. And it takes some time to find your joy, doesn't it? Like, for me, it certainly, I mean, I went to school, I was supposed to go to law school. I was supposed to be a lawyer, and that certainly didn't happen. And there's so many things that happened along the way before I finally found LinkedIn and writing and creating. And man, it is such a joy to be sitting with my daughter and having, you know, this amazing time with her, but also being like, oh, I really miss my work. Like, I don't know how many people actually can say, oh, I really miss my work. And so I feel really lucky that I'm able to do that, but it's definitely taken a long time to get to this point.
And the point that you just highlighted is that purpose actually cannot just be altruistic. There has to be that selfish, altruistic dimension
Yeah.
for us to have more joy in our life. And like you, I have come to realize as well that if you're just invested 100% in just on altruistic initiatives,
Yes.
to a point that you're losing yourself in the process, losing the capability to find joy, to even prioritize your own physical, emotional, and mental well-being, then you cannot show up and achieve those altruistic
Yes.
goals and purpose as effectively, right? Because
Yeah.
there's that balance, and I think
Yeah.
that balance is very, very natural. So I'm so happy that you have shared that.
Yeah, I remember hearing a quote that you should treat yourself like a toddler. And I love it, because I've got this toddler that I'm constantly tending to her needs, but I have an inner child too, you know, and I have my own needs. So sometimes it allows me to kind of be like, okay, what does that mean? It means that, you know, today, right now, I need a snack. I need to go color. I need to play, you know, and that's what, for me, like, my inner child is constantly like, I need to play. I need to create. And so kind of listening to what is your inner child? What's your inner toddler telling you? And what do you need to take care of is exactly what you're saying. Unless I'm doing those things, like right now, this is a day that I don't have Isla. And so I work twice a week, and the rest of the week is just lovely, because I mean, I'm so glad that I get to spend that time with her. But also, I have spent the last 2 days doing things for myself. And so that allows me to give even more to her.
I love that. So tell us what inspired you to name her Isla. I absolutely love this name, by the way.
Thank you very much. So my dad passed away a few years ago in 2019. And so it was before Isla was born. And he was from Trinidad and Tobago. So I spent a lot of my summers like either in Trinidad or in Barbados. Most of my family is from the islands. My husband and I actually got married on Grand Bahamas Island, and then we honeymooned in Eleuthera. So the islands, the Caribbean islands, are something that I hold near and dear to my heart. It's what I grew up with growing up, that whole culture. And so when he passed, I mean, obviously I don't want to name my daughter Horace, which is his name, but I loved the idea of incorporating my culture into her name. So we called her Isla Sol. So that means island sun. And it just kind of captures her background, but also the soul part of it, just bringing some sunshine to our life after so many storms. Fertility treatments were just, it's such a hard process and it's so hard to explain. It's the best way that I can explain infertility in general is like somebody dies every single month. And it's that part of you that is just yearning for motherhood. And so it's just this constant period of grief. There's just no relief because every single time you have a failed procedure or you see a negative pregnancy test, it just feels another piece of you dies. And it's a terrible process. So kind of feeling like Isla was, and I don't know if I shared the story, but she was our first transfer. She was an embryo that was too fragile to freeze. So they have to be a certain grade for them to be able to freeze and then transfer later on. She was what they call a fair embryo, meaning it just is not developing the same way that a higher grade one is. So they were actually saying, you know what, like either you can try and transfer her, or they didn't know who she was, or that she was a girl or female or male. But we can try and transfer the embryo, or we need to discard it because it's too fragile to freeze. And so I'm like, oh, let's just take a chance. It was only a 20% chance. So we really weren't expecting it to work because I've done other procedures that over 20% chances of success and they didn't work. So I was like shocked when she came about. So she really has just been such a determined little fighter from the very beginning. So she's definitely our little sunshine.
I love it. So beautiful and so inspiring. And as I'm thinking about her and the joy she has brought into your life, I'm thinking now about her life and the life of the younger generations, right? That we are all contributing to making the world a better place. What advice would you have for all of us collectively to create an existence whereby we can all live with more joy?
Yeah, I think that the best thing that you can do for not even just children, but for other adults is to walk the talk. You know, if you're saying that it's okay to make mistakes and it's okay to experiment and try new things and be selfish and pursue what sets your heart on fire, you also need to model that behavior. And so, just like we were talking about before, of model the type of person that you want your child to be like, I think is the best thing that you can do. I mean, I know growing up, my mom could have told me anything, but I always was watching her. I was always modeling her behavior and watching to see what she did. And so I think that when we give ourselves the permission to explore new things, to find happiness, find what makes us happy, to be ourselves. Like that is so huge. So many people are walking around trying to figure out, okay, what do I do next based on what other people's expectations are? I think living a life true to yourself is the single best way to raise a joyful next generation. So I try to do that the best that I can. Sometimes I fall into peer pressure too, like everybody else, where I'm like, okay, I'm just trying to do what's considered the next right thing. But there's a lot of times where I also try to kind of follow my own compass. And I hope that those are lessons that are passed on. But yeah, I think that the best way that you can create a joyful next generation is to give yourself permission to chase that joy for yourself.
Where does social media come in from
Ooh,
your perspective,
yeah,
particularly when we're reading so much that social media has such a negative impact
right.
on our emotional states?
Yeah.
How can we cultivate a
Yeah.
healthy relationship with social media, particularly given your experience with LinkedIn and all the followers that you have?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, social media in general it's a tricky thing. And I think that a lot of us are trying to figure it all out and learning because we didn't grow up with social media. So many of us kind of, maybe as a teenager, as an adult, discovered these new platforms. Nobody really knew what we were doing. It's kind of like, oh, you can connect with new friends. But then it's like it just kind of exploded from there. I remember like everybody talking, "Like, have you been on Facebook yet?" And I remember logging on the first time and I was like, oh wow, I can have friends all around the world. And I just thought it was like this amazing thing. And I still do stand by that. I do think that it's an amazing tool. I think that it can be both a blessing and a curse. And I think that for me personally, I have had to learn how to use social media really intentionally to know yourself. That is like the biggest thing, is knowing what triggers you, what feels good for me, what doesn't feel good for me, how much of this can I absorb before I need to take a break, is the most important. And thank goodness for algorithms, because we can actually tell the algorithm, hey, this doesn't make me feel good, show me less of this makes me feel good, show me more of this. And so I think doing a constant sweep of your social media presence and kind of looking at, okay, I'm following this person, but right now I'm really struggling with this, and they're constantly talking about their successes and all of this, and it doesn't feel good for me right now. Putting them on mute, giving yourself permission to unfollow even friends that aren't making you feel good, I think is really important. So I'm constantly going on, and if anybody is like, I'm getting that feeling where it's like not making me feel great, I'm not walking away feeling like recharged and pumped, is a big thing. I think also not taking it so personally. I work with a lot of clients that will talk about, oh, I just posted this on LinkedIn and it only got 10 likes. And it's become so intertwined with our value to see how many likes we've gotten on things. And it's designed to be that way, to kind of hook you. But on the flip side of that, it's creating a whole bunch of people that feel like nobody likes them, right? And feeling very lonely. So it has the potential of doing both, kind of bringing people together, but also isolating people where they feel like, well, nobody understands me, or nobody gets me, or nobody hears me. And so for me personally, I try to do more things that don't necessarily rely so much on numbers. So I've really been into, on LinkedIn, I really like newsletters, because I have my subscribers, but all I do is I share my story and then I am able to walk away from it. Because if I sit there and I'm creating all these posts and I'm seeing the numbers, even for somebody like me that does this for a living, I'll still sit there and be like, oh, it only got X amount of likes, people don't like me. I'll still have those feelings. And so finding outlets that don't necessarily rely on that as much is a really great thing to do. So if you really like writing, maybe not posting on social media, maybe it's writing a post on Medium, right? A blog platform where you're able to still have those creative outlets, but they don't rely so much on numbers and sharing and all that stuff. But finding, again, what feels good for you. I really like the audio events too on LinkedIn, because it's the same sort of thing. I show up, I share some information. People can either take it or they can leave it, but I'm not sitting there trying to decipher whether or not people like me, because we don't really have control over that. All we can do is share ourselves, share our content, share our stories, and then you put it out into the universe, and then it's up to the universe. So we really shouldn't try to tie our joy to things that we have no control over.
And it's so important what you're saying, because we forget the importance of doing things for the pure joy and the
Yeah.
pleasure it brings us. We're back to that selfish dimension that we just spoke about.
Yeah.
So if you really take pleasure in sharing your journeys, sharing your joys, and any other things that you think could actually be helpful for others, let's just leave it at that, rather than have all these expectations on
Right.
what would this lead in terms of my followers, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you so much for
Yeah.
sharing all that advice.
Oh, thank you. I would also say is knowing when you need to step back and take a break. is a big thing. I've taken so many breaks on social media, and I know sometimes I'll like jump on and just everything annoys me, right? You just know yourself where it's like, no, that's bothering me, that's bothering. And if it's too many people, I'm like, I think the problem is me. Right. And so knowing when you just need to step back, giving yourself permission to do that is really, really important as well. Everything has to be in moderation, right? Like, even like, I mean, I love ice cream, but I can't sit there and have tub after tub of ice cream or I'm going to feel sick. And the same thing is true for social media. It's kind of knowing what your limits are and not going beyond those.
Thank you so much, Michaela, for sharing that. I have one final question for you. If there would be anything that you could change in your life, would you change anything? And what would that be?
I know that a lot of probably the popular answer for this would be no regrets. I would change nothing because it made me who I am. And I think part of that is true. But I would say that the one thing that I would have changed in my life is not worrying so much about trying to find the perfect path. I think that especially when I was younger, I was trying to create this blueprint. That's why went through law studies because I was like, well, lawyer sounds like a lot more of a practical profession than film studies or getting into writing or being on stage. And it's so crazy to me because it's like when I was younger, I was like 8 years old and I was winning like these public speaking competitions. And people always say, like, whatever you're doing at 8 years old is what you should do for the rest of your life. And when I think back of it, it was reading, writing, and being on stage. And I just kind of put that in my back pocket. I don't know if it was school. I think it was just this need to prove myself to my parents, to society, to my friends, to everybody else. So I really feel like the beginning of my life, I kind of lived for other people. And it took me a really long time, I would say until I was 30 years old, that I actually was able to step back and be like, this is not what I want. And I keep kind of going through the motions of life, but nothing that I'm doing feels good. I'm constantly looking for validation from other people rather than chasing like that joy for myself. So that would probably be my biggest, the one thing that I would change would be, and I don't know if there was a way that I could even change that because I think that society right now is kind of set up to beat the creative entrepreneurial spirit of young people. But I wish that I would have had the courage to know myself and believe in myself enough to know that I was going to figure it out. Like it was all going to fall into place. I was a very reluctant entrepreneur. I was so terrified of doing things on my own because I felt like I had to be somebody's employee. But sure enough, working for myself now, I'm like, oh my God, how did I do anything else? Just because I love it so much. So yeah, I would say just not having the courage initially to step outside of my comfort zone. But everything takes time and it happens when it's supposed to. So I'm happy the way that things worked out too.
And I'm so happy for you. I mean, and basically the successes and everything that you've just shared is just testament that you had the courage to basically pursue your own path and really build your own path and journey that really is about you, right? It's about bringing your unique self out there and believing in that genius within you, because ultimately that's what life is all about. We're all unique. We all have distinct capabilities and strengths. And often, yes, as you said, society or, our education system or our families is pushing us to shape ourselves in the
Right.
vision that they
Yeah,
have
you have.
for
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
But you have to have the courage to follow your own path,
Yeah.
despite the uncertainties and unknowns and the ups and downs that comes with it. But life is so much more joyful when you actually take that courage.
It really is. And it's tough. I know that like there's some people that have huge family pressure to kind of conform to a certain way, but just like you're saying, it's their vision, it's not your vision. And unfortunately in life, you're going to disappoint people when you choose things for yourself, and you have to be okay with that. And that's something that for me, like, definitely did take time. But I also noticed that the more that I choose things for myself, the less anxiety I feel. And I think a big part of, especially when I was younger with agoraphobia and like the severe anxiety symptoms that I had, was because I was trying so hard to kind of mold myself into the type of person that other people expected me to be. And I've just noticed that I just feel so much lighter when I'm able to make decisions that just feel good for myself without worrying about whether or not my mom's going to approve or my dad would have approved, and kind of taking that pressure off of myself.
Thank you so much, Michaela. It's been an immense pleasure to have you with us today. Your wisdom and your insights are going to be very useful to a lot of the listeners that we have. So thank you again for joining us today, and may your life be filled with many more adventures and beautiful journeys. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I love that. Thanks.